Where might we look at, thinking about just fit for purpose, because we don't want extra profit. We want to make the customer happy, because in the longer term, they're going to stick with us and not go to our competitors.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers, and in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with process practitioners, process specialists, process experts, those that are involved in business process management in some way, shape, or form. We've spoken with many individuals across many different types of organizations. We've spoken with individuals that work from a consulting perspective or a consulting lens. We've spoken with many academics through this podcast as well. We've had Will van der Rolst on the podcast. We've had Marcello La Rosa on the podcast. Jan, last name is skipping my mind right now, but we've had sorry?
Jan Recker, I think, yeah.
That's right, Jan
Yes.
Recker, that's right. We've had many people on the podcast series, over 160 to date. Many names to remember, and some fantastic conversations there. Quite the database of educational content. It's all about educating you as the audience on the topic of business process management and the many different topics and conversations that surround this particular topic. So if you are joining us for the first time, a warm welcome. There's many other episodes for you to catch up on. And if you are a long-time listener, then a warm welcome back to you as well. We'd really appreciate a rating and a review on the podcast series on whatever channel or whatever platform you're listening to it on. It's really going to help us continue to spread the message and get this educational content out there. But without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. And I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Dr. Nadine Ostern and Dr. Wasana Bandara. Now, Dr. Nadine, she is the Cisco Chair in Trusted Retail and Logistics at the QUT Centre for Future Enterprises. And we have Dr. Wasana, who is an Associate Professor at QUT also, and is very much associated with the Process Science Group. They're very involved in business process management. So very excited for this conversation. Nadine, Wasana, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So I recently attended an event, and I want to start here. I recently attended an event at QUT, and you're both present there. You're both very much involved in this event called the Benevolent Enterprise, How to Operationalize and Scale Doing Good. And it was quite an interesting event, a very interesting event, quite an eye-opening event. And I think topics that I haven't heard much, but I think they're very important. I think that many organizations, when it comes to the topic of business process, I think oftentimes it's around how do we cut costs, how do we reduce waste, how do we create a process that's more efficient. And I'm sure all of our listeners are familiar with that, or they can resonate with that. But this event I went to at QUT, the Benevolent Enterprise, opened my eyes up to many other considerations or factors that we should be aware of. And I think one of the stories that really stood out to me and sticks to me to this day, I think it was Michael that mentioned this, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, but he was talking about a supermarket in the Netherlands, I believe, and essentially creating slow checkout lanes. So lanes that customers can come to, and it was developed for the aging population, wanting more human interaction, go to the supermarket, go to the slow checkout lane, and you've got people there that'll spend the time of day to have these conversations with. So that stuck with me, and I think but that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's many different case studies, many different use cases, and I really want to crack open this topic. So with all of that said, can you talk to us, and maybe Nadine, we'll start with yourself, talk to us about the Benevolent enterprise, because many of our listeners, it would be the first time hearing this as well. So can you give us a bit of a summary or an overview of what is a benevolent enterprise?
Yes, thank you. Happy to do that, because it's like benevolence in a for-profit section, for-profit organization seems a bit like attention, right? So to introduce it, I would also like to start with an example that actually happened to me a year ago, because that was also a starting point for me getting interested into this topic. And I was flying with my husband from Sydney to Brisbane on a morning after his birthday celebration. So you can imagine us rocking up at the airport a bit tired and just wanted to relax. So we came at the check-in and we knew our baggage were largely overweight. So normally I started to search for my credit card, ready to pay the excess fee and all the fines I have to pay for having too much luggage with us. But then she took our passports and the lady looked at us and said, "Oh, it's your birthday. You know what? That's on us." And she passed and waived the fee. And it really made our day. And that's something that we can see is very benevolent, right? It shows that you care as an organization for the customer. And that's basically the definition of benevolent. You as an organization try to demonstrate with a short-term investment that you really care for the customer's well-being. So this example sounds quite cute, and you might think like, oh, okay, you can do that or not, but who knows what the impact is. But what we see with this example is that it encouraged people to vote for 3 things, namely their money, their data, and their voice. So whenever I have to choose an airline, I would choose this particular airline the next time, because they treated us very, very nice. I would definitely share my data. So if I have the opportunity to say, hey, that's my birthday, I would do it again, anticipating that there might be some reward, maybe not, but who knows. And with my mouth. So every time I talk about benevolence, I share this example. And there you can see already the ripple effects of benevolence and how it creates better customer relationships. And done systematically, this is how we could create a benevolent organization.
That's fantastic. And it reminds me of a personal experience I had recently where I think I was shopping on Amazon and I put something into my Amazon cart, but I'd already had that item in there or something along those lines. And it actually warned me or notified me, hey, you've already got this in the cart, or maybe it was you've already purchased this item before or something along those lines. And it notified me, and I was like, oh, I don't need to. I've already got it, or I'm already waiting for it to show up. And then another time I've got a subscription for like toilet paper from Amazon that's coming as well. And my wife jumped onto my account and she went ahead and ordered toilet paper without realizing that we had a subscription and we were about to receive some in a couple of days. And she went ahead and ordered them. And in that case, there actually wasn't any pop-up or any notification. So in this experience, this benevolent enterprise concept, I was actually just thinking about this just a couple of days ago in my own life, being like, oh, it would have been fantastic if there was a notification or a warning. Hey, you've already got some on the way. You've already got a subscription set up. But Wasana, is there can you talk to us about maybe another use case or another example that comes to mind when it comes to the benevolent enterprise?
Yes, indeed. I can share with you an example that I experienced secondhand. I was with my very close friend. Her mom was in her last hours of life. And my friend had organized a package to be delivered. DHL people came in. There's a chaos with ambulance people. We were not ready to receive a parcel yet, let alone, take our attention from this person who needed us. And 2-3 hours later, when things settled down, we contacted DHL, explained to them this is what happened. And it was very, very kind. They organized not just the delivery, but also a bunch of flowers expressing their condolences. And they didn't have to do that. And that's exactly what benevolence is. It's an optional action that you can do, and that the action can create an enormous amount of effect. Nadine, still 2 years later, is talking about that one moment that may have costed literally nothing to the organization, and spreading the word of how this company cares about their customers. And the effect can have very strong links to relationships, short-term and long-term, which is what many companies need in order to gain profit in other ways. So benevolence, as much as there is a tension between, oh my God, you have to invest something, true, it might be an investment, but if done properly and planned properly, it can really have a very humongous impact on the longer term outcomes that the companies can achieve.
That's fantastic. And it brings another example to mind of, say, in a smaller context, like a restaurant or a cafe, and maybe a customer getting an order wrong. How much of a impact is it going to be for the restaurant to redo a meal if there's an incorrect order? It's probably not going to cost them a whole lot, but for that customer who has a gluten intolerance or is vegan or has some sort of dietary requirement and it made an incorrect order, how much more is that going to mean to them if the organization goes above and beyond? And I think it brings up this, I guess what we're talking about is this whole topic of trust. How can we trust the organizations that we're working with? How can we trust that they have our best interests in mind? And so I guess a question there is, why is this topic of trust so important for organizations to consider? Because I wouldn't say it is I wouldn't say I've come across it many times in the organizations that I work with. I wouldn't say trust is one of the highest indicators or needles that people are focusing on. So why do you believe that trust is so important, Nadine?
Yes, so there are so many angles to it, but let me start with the technology angle that I often use to motivate and also to raise awareness around this topic. So I think the interesting part about trust is it's so vital for organization, but still it's not tangible, and that's make it hard to make a business case around it. That's why it's so hard also to convince organizations to invest in trust. But what we see is that there's a large, what we call a trust gap. So organizations that are trustworthy are not trusted. And this trust gap needs to be closed. And we miss the practices, the tools to do that as organizations. And technology opens up this gap, because often what we see with technologies is that technologies are, for a large part of the population, sometimes not really accessible. So we don't know how maybe a complex AI work, maybe also, especially when it's linked to several other technologies, right? It's often not visible. So we may not even know that we engage with technology. And often it's also not optional. So imagine working into an airport or walking into a store. You either can say enter a store or not in a really physical environment where a lot of people not even think about technologies being there in comparison to online environments. So you can either decide to not go in, or you go in, but then it's not an option whether you use technologies or not. And when we see those environments like getting increasingly tech and data intensive, trust intensity grows equally. And that's why it's so important to build that trust, not only in the technology, but through technologies and implementing practices like benevolence, which is just one practice that we know of how we can build trust with a customer to make sure that we close this trust gap.
That's fantastic. And I know that at the when I attended this event on the Benevolent Enterprise, and the topic of the trust obviously was a big part of it, and talking about specifically 4 trust factors. Obviously, trust can be quite as you were saying, like it can be intangible. It can be quite a nebulous concept. What does it mean for an organization to be trustworthy? Can you talk to us about these 4 factors of trust, and what does that look like?
Yes, so we largely conceptualize trust as a promise that you make to a customer. And you have to build credibility in all those four areas, which are on the one side that we try to reduce vulnerability and uncertainty for customer. So vulnerability is all about like making sure that your data is protected, that you decrease the risks that happen for the customer, being like very or having your operations in place so that you have, for example, if you order something or if you have to rely on an organizational process, that this is in place and works as promised. This is what we call actually trust concerns. Trust concerns are things, if you don't care about those as an organization, this is a dropout reason for customers. So it's very vital to reduce uncertainty and vulnerability for the customer. But on the other side, and that we are especially focusing on, are trust opportunities. So showing confidence and showing that you are benevolent as an organization. Confidence could mean that I have signals in place that you can really trust me. For example, you maybe sell mattresses online, and this buying a mattress is a very like personal experience. There's so many factors, and a lot of people now buy mattresses online. And you may have an algorithm where you can answer some questions and you get your mattress delivered. The confidence sign is, hey, you can sleep on it like half a year and send it back without costs. This is the confidence sign. I'm so confident that this algorithm will find you the best mattress that you can send it back if you're not using it, or providing more transparency about the data that you are collecting, offering customers and individuals a tool that allows them to take more control could be a confidence signal. And then, of course, benevolence, which also builds what we call trust opportunities, which is at a moment of trust going beyond the customer's expectations and building trust through that.
Fantastic. That's great. And Wasana, what does that look like from a process perspective, in the sense that, you know, we've got an audience here of process practitioners, and typically they would be looking for, where are our bottlenecks, where are our long idle times, where are the areas of inefficiency in our process, how can we optimize the process, improve the process. How do we introduce this topic of trust to our process practitioners that maybe typically aren't thinking along these lines? Is it something where we need to bring more other stakeholders into the conversation? Where is this topic of trust really driven from?
So one of the key things to understand is things like benevolence, trust. They've been discussed and practiced for many, many decades, but often at a very high level, at an entire organizational level. In order to operationalize things and to make things actually come to life and to have scalability, these types of concepts needs to be embedded into the day-to-day business processes or the everyday practices. So when we talk about the concept of benevolence, about being kind and doing good, many companies have been doing that for many years, but under a different banner, not in their business as usual regime, right? So what we are suggesting is that just like we look for cost reduction opportunities, revenue generation opportunities, if you've got your business processes in front of you mapped and clear, we can identify moments in where you could embed benevolence. And we've started a journey of such. You may have heard about the patterns of benevolence in the event that you came to. And we've just identified 8 different patterns, just like we have 8 different types of process improvement patterns in other contexts, right? So these patterns gives us a frame of reference to see if that's the current as-is process that we have in front of us, where can we embed, for example, extra amounts of tolerance? Where can we, which is a pattern, right? Where can we build more awareness of what else is available to the customers? Where might we actually, instead of looking at selling things further, where might we look at, thinking about just fit for purpose? Because we don't want extra profit. We want to make the customer happy, because in the longer term, they're going to stick with us and not go to our competitors. So the work that we are doing is looking at mechanisms of how we could provide some guidelines to our practicing friends in the area. Once you've got their processes already there, similar to what we do with every other thing in process management. Having a frame of reference to identify where can we embed benevolence or trust moments to make that happen.
That's fantastic. And in talking about having this frame of reference, I think it's great that that's something. It makes it easy and simple for people to engage with this topic. Can you run us through that list of 8 patterns there that you referenced?
Yes. So we've got 8 different patterns, which or in the original publications that we've derived, we grouped them into 4, but I'm just going to talk about the 8 for now, right? The first one is what we refer to as adequacy. And this is where we are looking at opportunities to make sure that the product or service we offer fits the purpose for the individual. A good example could be things like utilities. Sometimes we might be buying a certain product that we might be paying, let's say, $100, but we're only using perhaps $30 worth of what that product offers. So a company that is proactively looking at the usage analytics and suggesting, look, you don't need a $100 package. Maybe you can go to a $30 package. We'll have one of those moments of, wow, this company really wants to make me save money and get the best product that I want. So that's one, adequacy. Another one is around awareness. And adequacy and awareness are both around the concept of being fair. And awareness is more like saying, there's a lot of, in many, many cases, there's so many times where we are paying for something, but we're not really utilizing it, right? So, for example, it might be in a scenario where you perhaps you may or may not realize you have paid for excessive amounts for warranties, extended product warranties. And sometimes the time elapses and you're kind of forgotten that you could have perhaps, gotten access to a certain repair earlier on. So awareness is proactively, and again, using information that you may have about the product, the usage, etc., making the customers aware that you have actually got this additional suite of things that you could be tapping into and using. And again, that is going beyond the profit generation perspective into the longer term building rapport with the organization. The second type of benevolence patterns goes into the concept of doing right and putting the customer first in doing right. So one interesting concept there is the notion of prevention. And then Nadine had some examples there about how in some European countries you're not allowed to take a scooter without a test, and if you pass the test, you can go. Otherwise, you are not allowed to hire that vehicle because you may have had alcohol, or you might not be safe, and you're trying to prevent the individual from having an accident. And this is an interesting concept because it might feel to the customer at that moment that they are being intruded. That's a right to get their scooter ride. But it's a longer term benefit for the organization or for the individual that comes into play. Another example is compensation. And I guess we can relate a lot to that. If we get the wrong product to get something else, or in terms of a product replacement or a product bundle, this heavily has a big role to play with Nadine, that Nadine was talking about in terms of confidence. The other 2 examples that are next is this concept about saying yes. And Nadine talked a very good example earlier, which we refer to as tolerance. Sometimes it's about, I've got 2 kilos extra. Could I please get through without a hassle instead of having to pay X amount of dollars? That's tolerating a threshold, right? And acceptance, on the other hand, is where you might again, a little bit like tolerance, but you might accept a request that's not the norm. So, for example, a doctor might say, I'm sorry, I can't give you a prescription without seeing you. I haven't seen you for the last 12 months. But maybe the doctor might decide, well, actually looking at the history, I know you live alone. I know you're 70 years old. I might consider giving this prescription to you because if I don't, you might not get the medications on time, for instance. The last 2 of the 8 is around being humane and kind. And the example that I experienced with my friend about, at that moment of that family losing a family member, a company was very It had nothing to do with the parcel delivery. Honestly, they were very empathetic to the situation, and recognizing negative moments in a person's life and being attentive to that. So you've heard about cases where, banks might understand that a partner has passed away and give some time to recover without putting the strict you must pay now processes in place. And the opposite to that is being attentive. When you achieve great things, it might be that, you might be a member of a gym and you've achieved a certain target, celebrating life together with your customers. Maybe the birth of a new child or retirement or a promotion, or what can we do to make sure that that individual is cared for, is noted, is important. So those are the 8 patterns, and we are exploring how they can be relevant in diverse contexts. And it's quite interesting to see how they can come into life in very different contexts. That's what we're seeing in our current research as we do this work.
No, that's fantastic. That's it's a lot of food for thought there. 8 different topics, and depending on the industry, depending on the organization, I can see many, many different use cases. One question that comes to mind, Nadine, is are there any risks associated with this? One risk comes to mind, a potential risk for a benevolent enterprise if our customers kind of abuse or misuse the benevolence. For example, I don't know if this is a good example, but an example is I was traveling to Auckland, flying to Auckland last week, and I was flying over there with a friend of mine, and they were in business class and I wasn't. And there were some spare seats in business class. And so I went up to the front desk when I was checking in, and I mentioned that to them, saying, hey, I can see that there's some spare seats that aren't taken. Can I sit next to my friend? And I wish the end of the story was that they said yes, but in this case, they said no. So I couldn't sit with my friend on this flight. But the question there is, as we develop and create more benevolent enterprises, is there the risk of that trust being misused and abused? How do we mitigate that risk, or how do we manage that risk?
Yes, that's a pretty interesting question. And I think it largely boils down to how we really address and implement those patterns. And I think there are a few differentiations we have to make. The one is it public or is it like private, the information that an organization is benevolent? So there might be like an overall narrative that they have benevolent practices in place, but maybe you don't want to be too public about it, like, hey, fly on your birthday and every time you bring too much luggage, you get a waiver. That's maybe not what you have in mind, but you can still have them like privately deciding that in special cases, you give the power to the employee to decide whether or not they give a waiver to this passenger. So make it less public and more private, but still making it, and that's the second differentiation I think we have to make, systemic. And what we see in the discussion about benevolence, everyone has like their example where they experienced organizations that are benevolent or were not benevolent, but it's not very well implemented from the organizations. Organizations don't have the toolbox and the practices to say, how do we set up a program that allows us to introduce benevolence into our business processes? And instead of doing it very sporadic, I think we have to do it in a private but systemic way of implementing those benevolent practices. And the second aspect to it is, I think, expectation management. So whenever you introduce something, it doesn't need to be benevolence. It could be also a confidence signal, for example, in building trust. You have to manage the expectations of your customers. So if you go to a lawyer, for example, they do it right away. They say, your chances of winning this case is 30%, but I will do my best. And this is expectation management. So when we say, there are benevolent practices, but they are largely up to the context and the case, and we don't publicly tell you when it will happen, what will happen exactly, so that there is the chance to exploit it. even if we may assume that the majority of people will not do that. But then we can manage expectations and set them right, instead of having the struggles and the problems afterwards.
No, that's great. That's very, very interesting. So we've got an audience here that I'm sure their interest has been piqued around this topic of the benevolent enterprise. Some of them would be in a position where they can implement change. Others are in a position where they can influence change, and others are in another position, many different positions. But for an organisation that want to start on this journey, or maybe not start on this journey, because I think, as you were saying, Wasana, that it's a practice that is in many organisations. But how do we scale this across the enterprise? Where do organisations start? You obviously listed out 8 different patterns there. Many different ways that it can be implemented. But if an organisation came to you and asked you, what should be, where do we start? What's step one? Simplify this for us. We don't want to boil the ocean, but we do want to start embedding more of these practices. What is step one?
I think the step one is to first target those customer-facing processes where the interactions between the customer and the company is, because that is where these acts of benevolence can be most impactful. Of course, benevolence can also come into play internally, like with the company and its employees, or with the company and its partners, like in a supply chain environment. But I would suggest to people who are interested in the area and would like to start, let's look at who are your customers and focus on those processes where those interfaces are. So, for example, quickly look at the different swim lanes if the processes are modeled where the customers are interacting with the company, and then see, could we do something better to make these interactions more meaningful for both parties, for the customer side and for the company side?
That's great. That's fantastic. And Nadine?
Yes, I totally agree with what Wasana said. I think another aspect that may add to that when it comes to the implementation is that there are patterns that might be very straightforward in some instances, like let's say the utility and you use less but pay for more. That could be basically hard-coded into your process. So once you have set up the algorithm, you can automate it. So this decision, when you can have nearly like a form of automated benevolence and scale up very quickly, versus where it's more the human touch to benevolence, which is more in the be humane, attentiveness, empathy, also the acceptance and tolerance space, where there's more like human decision-making, whether or not you want and how you want to demonstrate benevolence. These are different types and different levels of how much technological involvement there will be, how much you need to empower your employees. And I think those considerations also add to this process level considerations of what you really want to do and where you want to put the focus on the technical side or more the employee empowerment side.
That's great. And I think another thing that's coming to mind is how many unique selling points can come from this exercise for an organization that really differentiates themselves, their products, their services from other organizations. I can just think of the number of times where the decision I made to go with a certain product or service was based on maybe a seemingly minor benevolent practice that one organization had put in place, like a money back guarantee, or a try before you buy, or a support and like complementary support and services, or certain things like that that reduces that I guess the hesitation or the caution to go with a particular organization, or having decision fatigue around there are many products in this particular category. How do we decide on which one? Well, then if there's an organization that's putting some benevolent practices or making benevolent practices available, it makes the decision easier. And so I can certainly see that working in practice, and certainly it does tie into revenue generation for an organization directly.
Yeah, for sure. And we also say like benevolence and the whole idea of creating trust very proactively is for organizations a way how they can have a competitive edge in a very like not so easy environment that we experiencing now with global recessions and all what we deliver that we see. So where can you compete? And trust is one field where you can compete. And benevolence, as you described it so nicely, it always starts with the emotion that the customer has. And even it's like a short-term investment, you don't see the effects immediately. It starts with the emotion that builds through better customer organizational relationship, which then leads to a financial impact and profits for an organization if done well and implemented correctly.
That's good. And Wasana, just one other question. I mean, we could talk for hours about this topic. It's so broad and so diverse. I'm thinking of a particular experience recently with, I had personally where I was, we'd just trying to collect my thoughts and remember the exact scenario, but we have a subscription for our box of, actually, no, we don't have a subscription, but we order our like a bulk box of organic vegetables every month or so, every couple of weeks or something like that. And they had a certain discount or you can tell that my wife does the ordering, but she was saying that they had some sort of discount for a particular season or a particular period. And we actually missed that period, missed that date. And so it was a few days later, and I think, but we needed our vegetables. So my wife went to make the order. And that's when they mentioned about the recent sort of promotion that they just had. Would you say that it's about we need to build benevolence into processes, or do you think it's more of a cultural thing, or do you think it's a bit of both? Because I can see that from a cultural perspective, if the culture of the organization is we go above and beyond for our customers, and it's in the culture, then do we reflect that in our processes, or does it work better if it's implemented into our processes and it's not so much about the culture? Does that make sense, that question?
It does indeed. And I think the answer is both, because you might have certain scenarios where it starts with the culture and then goes into the processes because that's what the company wants to do. It could also be the other way around, where grassroots examples, the processes are actually doing certain things, and then they become the inspiration, aspirations for it to become the culture, the norm that's being shared. So both the culture, the technology that Nadine was speaking about earlier to scale things up and to utilize existing things like the data and stuff like that is very important. All three of them, the people/culture, the process, the technology needs to work hand in hand for something like benevolence to become a routine practice, part of the DNA of the organization in terms of how they do business, and to be able to scale up.
That's great. That's fantastic. And for the audience, for our listeners, that obviously it's a lot of them are learning about for the first time, and so I'm sure that you've piqued their interest. And now the remaining question is, where can we go to learn more? Obviously, I attended the event a few weeks back, and I walked away with the Benevolent Enterprise report, which it's fantastic, and there's a lot that's covered in this report. But for the podcast listeners now, Nadine, where should they start with to learn more about this topic, to become more educated and to prepare themselves to implement some of this stuff in their organization?
Yes, so the white paper that we published is certainly a good first starting point to get to know the topic, get a broad overview. So the interesting part is that benevolence in a for-profit sector, it's not very well researched in our field. So we're about to publish some papers that get hopefully accepted, but they are not out in the market yet. So the best way to get to know the topic is read the white paper, and with any questions, ideas to implement it, please come to us. We are a huge team that work not only on the white paper, but work in general on the topic of benevolence and broadening it out in various directions. So please come to us and have a chat, and we're very happy to consult and help with your benevolence journey.
Absolutely.
Perfect. That's amazing. Well, for those that are listening, if you do want to get your hands on this white paper, this report, then please connect with myself or connect with Nadine, connect with Wasana on LinkedIn would probably be the best way to go. And then we'll be able to direct you to to get your hands on a copy. So I just want to thank our listeners for tuning in for us today. I hope it's been an insightful conversation. And Dr. Nadine, Dr. Wasana, I just want to thank you both for sitting down with me today. Even though I attended the event, it's been a very insightful conversation for myself, and it's a very exciting topic. I think when you can this whole topic of creating a benevolent enterprise, operationalized scale, whilst doing good. So I just want to thank you both for sitting down with me and for having this conversation today.
It was our pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having us.